Welcome to the second session, in which we'll explore the works and philosophy of the 19th century essayist and lecturer Ralph Waldo Emerson. This time we'll consider Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, which was published in his first book of essays in the year 1841, along with Nature, the essay that was featured in our previous session. Self-Reliance is a compilation of thoughts recorded in his journal and in lectures over a period of 15 years, and is probably his best-known work. Primarily, it's an expression of Emerson's individualism and a call to man to trust his own intuitions and resist the limitations of conventional thought and institutions. It was one of the essays that helped establish him as one of America's most important writers and thinkers, but this was a recognition that developed gradually. Emerson's opinions were so candid and daring that they were originally met with much alarm, except by intellectuals and artists who shared or were inspired by his point of view. In addition, he often championed unpopular causes, such as his criticism and departure from orthodox religion, and his involvement in the abolitionist movement. The latter caused him to be mobbed both in Boston and Cambridge. However, opposition to Emerson never took a vicious personal turn, probably because he was so tactful and reasonable, and never attempted to deliberately incite controversy. In the end, he was considered a sage and even a prophet by some, and was afforded great respect and dignity. In Self-Reliance, the reader can find thoughts and ideas which are reminiscent of his other works, including Nature, which are connected to the basic beliefs of the transcendental movement, of which he was a key spokesman. The ideas of a soul, of the importance of spirit over materialism, of the value of nature, of the importance of intuition and imagination, and of the necessity for solitude and meditation are all present. But this time the focus is more on trusting oneself to know and to act in divine ways, rather than taking cues from the outside world. We'll take you through the essay point by point, and then we'll offer some possible interpretations of the ultimate message. Emerson begins his essay with a Latin motto that reads, "Ne te quae severius extra," which means basically, don't seek yourself outside yourself, or seek no opinion but your own. He then includes a poem which is taken from the epilogue of a book called Honest Man's Fortune, written by Beaumont and Fletcher. It reads, "Man is his own star, and the soul that can render an honest and a perfect man commands all light, all influence, all fate. Nothing to him falls early or too late. Our acts our angels are, or good or ill, are fatal shadows that walk by us still." Following this, he tells us that he has just read some verses by a famous poet, which were very original, and he finds such verses to be an admonition to his soul. The reason for this admonition is that he has recognized in the verses some of his own original thoughts and is reminded that he should trust them. Man, he will later elaborate, often doesn't believe his own thoughts until he sees them somewhere else. He says, to believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Emerson felt that our deepest convictions and thoughts have universal significance, and that what is true for us in our own hearts is true for all men. We recognize these thoughts when we see them in the work of others, as he did in the verses by the painter. When we do recognize such thoughts, they take on, in his words, a certain alienated majesty. That sense of majesty should convince us to rely on our own impressions. Otherwise, he says, a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our own opinion from another. Great artists and geniuses never take their thoughts from each other. Moses, Plato, and Milton ignored books and traditions, and spoke not what men thought, but what they thought. Most men, however, dismiss their own thoughts simply because they belong to them. Emerson writes, "A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within," and he adds, he should pay more attention to the gleam than he does to the beautiful words of writers and sages. In the next session of the essay, Emerson talks about individuality, suggesting it is God-given. We are ashamed of that divine individuality, and therefore only half express ourselves. Yet until we express the other half, there will be no inspiration, no genius, no invention, no hope. This requires courage, and it requires acceptance of the place, society, and events in which God has placed us. We must accept our transcendent destiny, not flee from it like cowards, and we must go forth as redeemers and benefactors, advancing against chaos and the dark. Then Emerson talks about children and young people, and how they embody the qualities he's describing, how we all once embodied them. He says the nonchalance of boys who are sure of dinner and would disdain to conciliate anyone is the healthy attitude of human nature. The boy is master of society, independent, irresponsible, looking out from his corner at people and facts that pass by, trying and sentencing them on their merits. He doesn't worry about consequences. He gives an independent, genuine verdict. You must court him. He doesn't court you. The adult man, in contrast, is a captive. He cares about the opinion of others and the praise of his fellow man. He no longer has the unbiased, unaffected, unbribable innocence of his youth. Society, according to Emerson, is a conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. It holds conformity as the greatest virtue and self-reliance as the enemy. It loves names and customs more than it loves realities and creators. In summary, one's own opinions and thoughts, which are so clear and strong in solitude, become obscured when we enter the outside world. Therefore, whoever would be a man must be a nonconformist. Furthermore, a man can't be hindered by goodness or what society says is goodness, but must instead explore what goodness is. He says, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of our own mind." He remembers how once, when being encouraged to consider the doctrines of a church, he replied, "What have I to do with the sacredness of traditions, if I live wholly from within?" No law is sacred to Emerson but the law of his nature. Therefore, the only good or right is what aligns with that nature. The only wrong is what is against it. He is ashamed to think how much people capitulate to large societies and dead institutions, and to names and badges. Every decent and well-spoken individual sways him more than is right. He should be truthful, even if the truth is rude and rough. For, he says, truth is handsomer than the pretense of love. Emerson then expresses doubt about philanthropists, the people who would, in his words, put all poor men in good situations. He says he grudges every cent he gives to the poor because such people don't belong to him, and he doesn't belong to them. He has no spiritual affinity with them, although for people with whom he does share a spiritual affinity, he says he'd be willing to go to prison. About philanthropy, he says, "But your miscellaneous popular charities, the education at college of fools, the building of meeting houses to the vain end which many now stand, alms to drunks, and the thousandfold relief societies, though I confess with shame I sometimes succumb and give the dollar. It is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold." Virtue, he continues, is an exception rather than a rule. Men do good actions like they pay fines, as if it's an apology for living in the world. Their virtues are really penances. My life, he says, is not an apology but a life. Furthermore, men like to parade their virtue. His life, he says, is for itself and not for a spectacle. He believes a life should be unique and shouldn't rely on assurance from others. He's concerned only with what he must do and not what people think. And this rule, he says, which is equally difficult to live up to intellectually and in actuality, is the whole distinction between greatness and smallness. It's particularly hard because there are always others who think they know your duty better than you do. It's easy to live in the world by the standards of the world's opinions. It's easy to live in solitude and follow your own. But the great man is the one whom he describes as he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. To be a nonconformist, one must concentrate one's force. Conformity scatters that force, wastes your time, and blurs the impression of your character. He says, if you maintain a dead church, contribute to a dead Bible society, vote with a great party either for the government or against it, under all these screens I have difficulty detecting the precise man you are. It's impossible to know what the constantly conforming man really thinks about anything, and most men do attach themselves to some community of opinion. This conformity makes them false, not in just a few particulars, but in all particulars. Then Emerson spends a short paragraph on what he calls the foolish face of praise, the forced smile we put on when we're in the company of people or conversation that doesn't interest us. He considers this expression mortifying and says no brave man will suffer it twice. The nonconformist must be prepared to face the wrath of both the cultivated classes and the common people. Says Emerson, for nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. Of these two classes, he finds the rage of the cultured class easier to bear. Their rage is decorous and prudent, what he calls a feminine rage, and they're timid because they recognize the same thing could easily happen to them. But it's harder to bear the rage of the ignorant and the poor, or what he calls the unintelligent brute force that lies at the bottom of society. The next passage of the essay is its most acclaimed and contains what many critics believe to be the most valid point of the work. In this section, Emerson talks about another obstacle to self-trust, what he refers to as consistency, a tendency to want to act as we have in the past, so as not to disappoint others. He calls on people to trust their emotions and says, "When the devout motions of the soul come, yield to them heart and life, though they should clothe God with shape and color. Leave your theory as Joseph his coat, in the hand of the harlot, and flee." A foolish consistency, according to Emerson, is the hobgoblin of little minds. Great souls, on the other hand, have nothing to do with consistency. They speak what they think today, and tomorrow they speak what they think tomorrow, even if it contradicts what they said the day before. Of course, the result of this is that you'll be misunderstood. But what is wrong with being misunderstood, he asks. Pythagoras was misunderstood, as were Socrates, Jesus, Luther, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever lived. To be great is to be misunderstood. Inconsistency, Emerson goes on to say, doesn't really exist anyway. Even in the midst of variety, unity prevails. All the varied thoughts will in the end be found to be symmetrical. Even in his bursts of will, man can't violate his nature. The key to action, therefore, is naturalness. Each action must be honest and natural in its hour. Then there is always consistency. The actions will be harmonious, however different they seem, because they all spring from the same tendency toward honesty. He compares such actions to the voyage of a ship. Ships travel in a zigzag line, but if you see this line from a sufficient distance, it straightens itself out. This is what happens to the apparent inconsistencies of honest thought and deeds. Genuine actions explain themselves, and they explain future actions, whereas conformity explains nothing. The force of character is cumulative. Greatness is an act that now leads to greatness in the future. In the next passages, Emerson returns to his dominant theme of man, explained in other works as well, which he calls man-thinking. His call to action reads this way: "Let us bow and apologize nevermore. A great man is coming to eat at my house. I do not wish to please him. I wish that he would wish to please me. I will stand there for humanity, and though I will be kind, I will be honest. Let us reprimand the mediocrity and contentment of the times, and hurl in the face of custom the fact that is the upshot of all history, that there is a great responsible thinker and actor moving wherever moves man. A true man," he says, "is the center of all things, and belongs to no place or time. Every true man is a cause, a country, and an age. All of history can be condensed into the biographies of a few great men. As examples, the Reformation was Luther, Quakerism was Fox, Methodism was Wesley, abolition was Clarkson. But the common man becomes intimidated by history. He sees no worth in himself when he compares himself to those who built a tower or sculpted a marble god. But he too, when he awakens and finds his reason, is a true prince. On the other hand, our imagination makes fools of us when we interpret history as only kingdoms and lords, power and estate. The private man who acts with original views has just as much luster as kings and gentlemen. Suppose these great men were virtuous. Did they wear out virtue? It is equally accessible to the common man today, living in a small house doing a day's work. This adoration of kings has obscured man's consciousness in his own right and comeliness. The true aristocracy consists of men who respect themselves and act on their convictions. The source of all these actions is what Emerson calls the aboriginal self. The essence of genius, virtue, and of life is spontaneity, instinct, and a primary wisdom that we call intuition. If intuition is primary wisdom, then all later teaching are tuitions. The self-reliant man knows there is a difference between voluntary acts of his mind and involuntary perceptions, and he gives his faith to the involuntary perceptions which spring from the aboriginal self. He may not express these perceptions correctly or adequately, but he knows they can't be disputed. This perception or intuition is fundamental to man-thinking, to become self-reliant. In that deep force of intuition which can't be analyzed, all things find their common origin. We can affirm its presence or absence, but if we ask from where it comes or why it exists, we have asked too much. People will argue with your perceptions that rise out of intuition as much as they'll argue your opinions. They can't tell the difference. They think you have chosen to see a thing this way or that way. Yet the thing you have seen will eventually be seen by your children, and in course of time, all mankind. For intuition to work, its channels must be clear, direct, and uninhibited by dependence on other authorities. Whenever a mind is simple and receives divine wisdom, all other things pass away: teachers, books, temples, and methods. It lives now in the present, and past and future cease to exist. Says Emerson, "If therefore a man claims to know and speak of God, and carries you backwards to the phraseology of some old moldy nation in another country, in another time, don't believe him." Man is timid, and would rather quote a saint or sage than say, "I think." Man postpones or remembers, but he doesn't live in the present. He laments the past or tries to look ahead to the future, but he will never be strong or happy until he lives with nature in the present, above and beyond time. This should be obvious, but instead we live like children, who repeat by rote the words of teachers and tutors, or as adults we quote men of talent and character we chance to see. All of this rubbish is gladly discarded when we have perception. People are not always comfortable in the position of being in the present. In the present there is no such thing as power, for power relies on changing circumstances. Emerson says, "This one fact the world hates, that the soul becomes. For that forever degrades the past, turns all riches to poverty, all reputation to shame, and confounds the saint with the rogue. Yet whoever has more soul masters those who have less, and they must revolve around him by gravitations of spirit. Those men who are formed and who live by the law of nature overpower all cities, nations, kings, rich men, and poets who do not." Self-reliance is based on the soul's affinity with God, and this affinity requires solitude. It doesn't require withdrawal from society, friends, and family, but it does require spiritual solitariness. Sit at home, says Emerson, without the rabble of men and books. Go it alone, for isolation must precede true society. Emerson says he likes the silent church before the service begins, better than he likes any preaching. So let us sit like that, but our isolation must be spiritual, not mechanical. It must elevate us. At times there seems to be a conspiracy against solitude. Friend, client, child, sickness, fear, want, and charity all knock at the door and demand that we come out. But keep your station. Stay in your own heaven. Don't be drawn into their hubbub. Instead, let the light of your law into their confusion. Emerson then suggests that a man inform his friends of the oath he is taking. An oath to be himself, to obey an eternal law, to put that law before everything else. They must love him for what he is, and if they can't, he will still seek to deserve that they would. If they are noble, he will love them, but if they are not, he won't pretend at affection. If they're not in the same truth as he, they must seek their own companions, and he will seek his. He knows this view can cause pain to those closest to him, but says, "I cannot sell my liberty and my power to save their sensibility." Besides, all persons have their moments of reason, when they look out in the region of absolute truth, and at that point they will justify me and do what I have done. It is the law of consciousness, and the law prevails. There are two ways of satisfying duties. One is reflex, in which man absolves debts toward his family and friends. The other, which Emerson holds as the strictest responsibility of all, is the direct one, in which man absolves himself only to himself. This path denies duty to many conventional offices, but if the man can discharge his debts to himself, he can dispense with the popular code. There is something godlike in trusting oneself as a taskmaster, and it demands a great deal, being high in heart, faithful in will, and clear in sight, so that man becomes his own doctrine, society, and law. Society itself makes such ethics necessary, for we have become afraid of truth, of death, and of each other. Our age produces no great or perfect persons. Most people can't satisfy their own wants and have ambitions which are out of proportion to their practical force. Our arts, occupations, marriages, and religion have been chosen for us by society. We are parlor soldiers. We fight the small, superficial battles and run from the rugged battle of fate, where we find our true strength. The next paragraph of the essay reads this way: "If our young miscarry in their first enterprises, they lose all heart. If the young merchant fails, men say he is ruined. If the finest genius studies at college and is not installed in an office within 1 year afterwards in Boston or New York, it seems to everyone that he has the right to be disheartened. A sturdy lad from New Hampshire or Vermont, who in turn tries all the professions, who teams it, farms it, peddles, keeps a school, preaches, edits a newspaper, goes to Congress, buys a township, and so forth in successive years, and always like a cat falls on his feet, is worth 100 of these city dolls. He does not postpone his life. He lives already. Emerson goes on to say that it's time not to pity, but to revere the man who tosses the laws, the books, the idolatries, and customs out the window. Self-reliance means nothing less than a revolution in all the offices and relations of men, in their religion, in their education, in their pursuits, in their modes of living, their association, in their property, in their speculative views. In all these areas we look too much abroad and too little to ourselves. As an example, he cites the practice of prayer. When men pray, he says, they ask for a particular commodity they crave. Prayer is used as a means to effect a private end or to express discontent and regret. These are false prayers. They rely on a false sense of duality and reflect no unity with nature or consciousness. As soon as man is at one with God, he ceases to beg. Instead, he sees prayer in every action. The prayer of the farmer kneeling in the field to eat it, the prayer of the rower kneeling with the stroke of the oar, are true prayers heard throughout nature. At this point, Emerson talks about travel, or as he calls it, the idol of traveling. The idol of Italy, England, or Egypt remains for educated Americans. Yet those men who made Italy, England, or Greece great didn't do it by rambling around creation as a moth round a lamp, but by sticking fast where they were, like an axis on the earth. The soul is no traveler. The wise man stays at home with the soul, and when his duties call him from his house or into foreign lands, he is at home still. He who travels in search of amusement or to gain something he doesn't carry within travels away from himself. It is from a lack of self-culture that man seeks culture in foreign lands. Those who have traveled soon learn that place means nothing. Any sadness they have within, they carry with them. This rage for travel is symptomatic of a deeper unsoundness which affects all intellectual action. The intellect, claims Emerson, is vagabond, and our system of education fosters restlessness. In educational systems, endless imitation like traveling is another form of escapism. Our opinions, our tastes, our whole minds follow the past and the distant just as a traveler does. Yet wherever the arts have flourished, it was the soul that created it. It was in the mind of the artist. Why do we need to copy Doric or Gothic models when beauty and grandeur are just as near to us in our own minds, if we study with hope and love? Insist on yourself, never imitate. Do what is assigned you. Dwell in the simple, noble regions of life. Obey your heart, and you shall reproduce greatness. In the next and closing section of the essay, Emerson makes the point that the spirit of society doesn't demonstrate self-reliance either. Society doesn't advance. Every time there's an apparent gain, there's also a loss. And it's continually changing. It's barbarous, it's civilized, it's Christianized, it's rich, it's scientific. But as it acquires new arts, it loses old instincts. Life has become flabby and easy. Man has got a watch but can no longer tell the time from the sun. Man has an almanac but can't recognize one star in the heavens. Through machinery, we have lost energy and refinement. To become so over-civilized is to lose touch with the primitive, the elemental, with nature. Yet in spite of all these external changes, the moral standard doesn't change. Men are not greater now than they once were. The great men of the first age and of the last age are equal. None of the science, art, religion, and philosophy of the 19th century produces greater men than Plutarch's heroes 3, 4, or 20 centuries ago. New inventions are superficial and do nothing to inspire men. Galileo, with only an opera glass, discovered more splendid facts than anyone since. Columbus, in only an undecked boat, found a new world. New machinery doesn't increase our chance of greatness and may even do more harm than good. Great genius always returns to the essential man. Even reliance on institutions such as religions or government shows a lack of self-reliance. Men measure their esteem of each other on the basis of property, what each has. But a cultivated man becomes ashamed of property. He knows this: that which a man is brings him the only real property, permanent and living property, which is not subject to rulers, mobs, revolutions, fires, storm, or bankruptcies, but which perpetually renews itself. Our dependence on false property has made us slaves of numbers. How much? How many? At political conventions, the young patriot feels he's stronger than before, by the thousands who share his affiliation. But it is only when man pulls away from external support and stands alone that he is strong and will prevail. Every banner or slogan that recruits him only makes him weaker. He is weak only because he has looked for good outside of himself. Emerson has now reached the end of his essay. The final paragraph of Self-Reliance reads, "A political victory, a rise of rents, the recovery of your sick, or the return of your absent friend, or some other quite external event, raises your spirits, and you think good days are preparing for you. Do not believe it. It can never be so. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. Like many of Emerson's essays, Self-Reliance is a stirring and provocative piece of writing that lit a fire under his audience and led some young people to herald him as a prophet. Along with his essay, Nature, it gave force and definition to the American transcendental movement and has been resurrected in the century and a half since it was written by generations compelled to seek inner truth and disenchanted by the rigid confines and demands of modern society. Emerson is, among other things, an impassioned social critic in his essay. He criticizes the ironclad traditions of institutions such as church and state, the false value put on materialism and property, the cowardice of conformity, and the pointlessness of technological inventions. He himself, as you'll recall, walked out on organized religion when he resigned as a pastor of the Unitarian Church because he found some of their rites ridiculous. His essay is therefore as much about rejecting as it is about accepting. It's as much about nonconformity as it is about self-reliance. Let's review the key principles of self-reliance as you've just heard them described. 1. Self-reliance relies on the soul's affinity with God. 2. Man must learn to trust his own thoughts and not wait to have them validated by someone else who appears wiser and greater. He should pay more attention to those gleams which flash in his own mind than he does to the words of poets and sages. 3. Society is a conspiracy against the manhood of the individual because it holds conformity as the greatest virtue. Men should learn to be like young boys again, who give nothing for the opinion of others, who are neutral and honest in their assessment of what they see, and who don't worry about the consequences of their honesty. 4. Man mustn't be swayed by what society says is goodness. He must himself decide what is good. Nothing is sacred but the integrity of the mind. The only thing that is really good is that which aligns itself with man's true nature. 5. Consistency is another obstacle to self-reliance. Men worry about changing their thoughts and opinions, but this worry disappears when man gives up caring what others will think of him, when he realizes variety is part of nature, and that even variety is illusionary, since it exists within unity. 6. Men must put their faith in the involuntary perception, which springs from the aboriginal self, the primitive self from which intuition is born. 7. The self-reliant man is centered in the present. 8. Self-reliance requires solitude so that man may connect with his inner self. 9. There is a moral standard that is eternal and never changes. Men are not greater now than they once were, and are no less great. Greatness is always there when we remain true to our real selves. And finally, such externals as travel, social institutions, and property can never bring true and lasting happiness. This comes only from within, after discovering one's intuition and the source of that intuition. The overall message of self-reliance is the absolute necessity of living from the inside outward rather than from the outside inward. Emerson's overriding idea is that a man must discover his inner nature, what is unique about him, and then must act on the conviction of that self. If he does this, he becomes man-thinking, a man of the soul. In this critical process, it's better if he can avoid the distractions and dangers of external society, as well as the world of past and present. All this surrounds him and tempts him to conform, because it seems a more comfortable, secure, and easier course. But real happiness, genius, and greatness are achieved only by discovering and remaining true to the inner, primeval, and eternal voice of intuition.
This is the end of the session.